Submerged within the claustrophobic confines of a homemade submarine, we trace Kim Wall's final hours through the chilling, rhythmic patter of steady rainfall. We dissect the technical engineering of the vessel against the harrowing silence of the deep sea, maintaining a somber, clinical cadence that honors the gravity of this maritime tragedy. This is not a story told from a distance. It does not arrive wrapped in the language of sensation or spectacle. It is a precise account of a journalist, a vessel, and an August night in 2017 that ended in a way no one who knew Kim Wall could have prepared for. What follows is told with the same commitment she brought to every story she ever wrote. No embellishment, no shortcuts, and no turning away from what the evidence ultimately revealed. The facts of this case are deeply uncomfortable. They occupy the space where professional trust meets physical vulnerability, where public admiration functions as a mechanism of concealment. They demand to be handled with care, not because they are fragile, but because the person at the center of them was real, her work was real, and her story deserves to be carried with the full weight it is owed. We begin at the water. We begin on August 10th, 2017, at a harbor on the northeastern edge of Copenhagen, where a woman walked toward a submarine and a hatch closed behind her that she would never pass back through. Everything that follows from that moment is drawn from forensic records, investigative documentation, and courtroom testimony. This is the account that evidence assembled, told in the order it happened, and held to the gravity it deserves. Refshalewen sits on the eastern edge of Copenhagen harbor, separated from the city's more traveled waterways by distance and industrial history. It was once a working shipyard, a place where vessels were built, repaired, and launched into the Sound. By 2017, it had become harder to categorize. Part cultural hub, part forgotten infrastructure, part open waterfront where wind moved without interruption across dark water. On the morning of August 10th, the harbor wore the sky like a second skin. The overcast light was flat and uniform, the kind that drains warmth from color and makes distances difficult to judge. The water was not quite black, moving in the low, restless way that coastal water does when weather is building somewhere beyond the horizon. The rain had started early and settled into a steady, unhurried rhythm by the time morning had fully arrived. It did not fall in sheets or sudden bursts. It fell the way rain does when it intends to stay, consistent, quiet, almost deliberate in its persistence. It collected on the industrial surfaces of the harbor, on rusted metal and weathered timber, and ran in thin channels toward the water. It struck the harbor surface in thousands of small, simultaneous impacts that produced a sound both diffuse and precise, a texture of noise that filled the air without ever becoming loud. This is the sonic environment into which Kim Wall walked on that morning. Nothing dramatic framed it. Nothing theatrical announced what the day carried. Just a gray August morning, rain falling the way Danish rain falls in summer, and a harbor that had seen stranger things than a journalist arriving to conduct an interview aboard a privately built submarine. The water offered no warning. The weather provided nothing that could be read as a sign. It was simply the conditions of the day, and the day began the way most days begin, in the ordinary, indifferent light of before. She arrived at the harbor the way she arrived everywhere, prepared, purposeful, carrying the particular kind of focused calm that comes not from the absence of awareness, but from its full presence. Kim Wall was 30 years old. She was a journalist whose work had taken her to Uganda, to North Korea, to the Marshall Islands, to places most people only encountered on maps, and she had moved through all of them with the same deliberate, open attention she brought to everything she reported. She was not someone who entered unfamiliar environments carelessly. She was someone who entered them with her eyes fully open. She had contacted Peter Madsen months earlier, drawn by a story she believed was worth telling. He was known publicly as a self-made engineer, a man who had built rockets and submarines through sheer determination, and the kind of outsider ambition that attracts media interest almost by nature. The interview she had arranged aboard his submarine, the UC3 Nautilus, was professionally unconventional. It was also, by the standards of international feature journalism, exactly the kind of access that makes a story come alive. She had told Ole Stobb, a partner, where she was going. The communication between them that morning was ordinary, routine, the kind exchanged between two people who expect to speak again before evening. She stepped onto the dock at Refshaleon, and the vessel came into full view ahead of her. The UC3 Nautilus sat low in the grey water, its hull dark and utilitarian, a machine that made no concessions to comfort or aesthetics. It was the product of years of unconventional engineering work, a vessel that had no business existing outside of institutional infrastructure, and yet existed precisely because one man had decided it would. The rain continued to fall. The water around the hull moved in small, indifferent patterns. Kim Wall walked toward it. The UC3 Nautilus did not idle quietly. Even moored, it produced a low, constant mechanical presence, a vibration that was felt as much as heard, running through the hull and into the dock beneath it. The vessel operated on systems that required continuous attention: ballast tanks, compressed air lines, diesel and electric propulsion working in combination to keep a hand-built machine functional in an environment that hand-built machines have no natural right to occupy. The hum of it was the sound of sustained effort, of engineering held together by design and will in equal measure. Peter Madsen was already aboard. The transfer from dock to vessel was brief, practical, and unremarkable to any observer who might have been present. Kim Wall descended into the interior of the UC3 Nautilus, and the hatch was sealed behind her. That sealing was not dramatic in its mechanics. Hatches on submarines close the same way they always close, metal against metal, compression establishing a seal, the external world reduced first to muffled distance, and then to nothing at all. The sound of the rain, which had been continuous and present since morning, stopped. The grey light of the overcast sky, which had flattened everything at the harbour into the same muted register, disappeared. What remained was the interior of a vessel 11 meters long, with a ceiling low enough to require constant physical awareness and two people occupying a space that the rest of the world could no longer see into. The UC3 Nautilus moved away from Refshaleon and into the open water of the Øresund Strait. The harbour receded. Copenhagen receded. The rain continued to fall on a surface that the vessel was no longer part of. Below it, the world above had ceased to exist in any way that mattered to what happened next. If this kind of story is what you come to this channel for, subscribe now and follow along. There is more where this comes from, and none of it arrives quietly. As the heavy latch clicks into place, the rain-slicked world of the harbour is replaced by the smell of diesel and the weight of steel, where the vessel's anatomy becomes the only boundary between life and the crushing depth of the sea. The UC3 Nautilus was built as an expression of private ambition, the kind of vessel that announces its maker before it ever speaks for itself. It was not a commercial submarine, not a naval craft, and not a machine designed with layers of institutional oversight. It was a one-off project, assembled through skill, persistence, and the conviction that a small team could turn an idea into a working submersible. That fact alone gave it an aura of achievement. Yet the same qualities that made it remarkable also made it unforgiving. A submarine built by hand does not lose its severity simply because it was built with imagination. Inside, the vessel was narrow enough that movement had to be deliberate. There was no room for casual comfort, no broad interior to ease the body into the journey, no generous margin for movement once the route began. The hull compressed everything into functional necessity. Controls, instruments, piping, and mechanical systems occupied the space that a larger craft might reserve for separation and ease. Every surface had a task. Every inch had a purpose. In such a setting, the human body is not only a passenger, It becomes part of the equation, forced to adjust itself to the machine rather than the other way around. The limited access points mattered as much as the shape of the interior. A submarine can look composed from the outside and still contain an architecture of restriction within it. Entry and exit are never casual in a vessel like this. Hatches are not decorative components. They are thresholds between survival and exposure. And in a small craft, the number of thresholds is part of the entire moral structure of the machine. Once inside, the available choices shrink. The conditions become fixed. A space that is merely compact on land becomes a sealed reality below the surface. That is what makes the Nautilus so unsettling as a human creation. It carried evidence of extraordinary effort, yet it also embodied confinement. Its builder had pursued the challenge of making a submarine by private means, and that pursuit demanded a remarkable level of technical confidence. But the result was not freedom. It was a vessel whose ingenuity depended on the strict cooperation of many systems at once. Propulsion, ballast, power, air, and pressure. Control all had to function together. If one failed, the consequences reached quickly through the rest. In a machine of this kind, dependency is not an abstract idea. It is structural law. The interior layout reinforced that reality. There was no place to stand apart from the machine and observe it with detachment. The people inside the vessel lived inside the working parts of the vessel. The body sat close to the engine, the controls, and the sealed compartments that kept the craft operational. The hum of machinery was not a feature to be noticed and then ignored. It was part of the environment itself. In a confined submersible, the sounds of the vessel are not background noise in the ordinary sense. They are signs that the system is holding together. When those sounds change, the world inside changes with them. On the surface, the Nautilus could seem almost ordinary in its purpose-driven movement. There were the mechanical notes of preparation, the subtle shifts of weight, the low signals of systems being brought into line. Those noises had a practical quality, the sound of a machine readying itself for use. Yet the moment the vessel leaves the harbor and begins to separate from open air, the character of those sounds changes. The motor becomes more than a motor. The clink of metal becomes more than a clink. Even the smallest sound takes on sharper meaning because there is so little else to hear. Then comes the transition that makes submarines unlike almost any other vehicle. The sound of the surface falls away, not all at once, but in stages. First, the dock disappears. Then the weather recedes. Then the familiar texture of the world above loses its claim on the ear. What remains is pressure, enclosure, and the measured function of the craft itself. In that silence, the vessel feels less like transport and more like condition. The lack of outside noise is not peaceful. It is absolute. It tells everyone inside that they have crossed into a place where distance is no longer visible and where the normal cues of orientation no longer apply. A privately built submarine carries a special kind of tension because it joins admiration to vulnerability. People may look at such a machine and see vision, persistence, or even beauty in the engineering challenge. That reaction is understandable. Building a submarine from scratch is no small accomplishment. But the same craft that inspires that response can become intolerable the moment it is sealed. The interior does not care about the romance of invention. It responds only to pressure, air, and the discipline of its systems. What seems daring on land becomes a closed world under the surface, one that offers no easy correction if something changes. This is why the structural truth of the Nautilus matters so much. Once the hatch closes, authority inside the vessel is no longer shared in any meaningful way. The person who controls entry, movement, and access controls the entire environment. There is no public corridor, no witness just beyond a door, no simple way to step out of one person's power and into another's. Inside that hull, survival depends on the person who can open the way, maintain the systems, and decide what happens next. The machine itself becomes a sealed order of dependence. That fact is not dramatic, it is mechanical. It is built into the craft. A submarine gives enormous power to the one who governs the sealed space, because the sealed space itself removes options. What matters then is not only the vessel's engineering, but the moral weight of who occupies it and how they use the control it grants. A harbor can hold many stories at once. A submarine, once sealed, tells only one at a time. Everyone else is left outside that certainty, and so the Nautilus is not just a machine in this story. It is a structure of isolation disguised as ingenuity, a crafted environment where every restraint becomes more severe after departure. The engine may continue to run. The hull may remain intact. The lights may still work. But the deeper reality is simpler and harsher. When the hatch seals, the balance of power inside the vessel belongs to the person who holds the means of release. For anyone else within that hull, the space itself has already begun to close around them. Kim Wall grew up in Trelleborg, a coastal town where the sea sat close enough to shape daily life, yet far enough away to feel ordinary. Her childhood home was filled with discussion, not noise. Her parents spoke about science, reporting, politics, and the habits of asking careful questions before claiming certainty. That atmosphere gave her an early respect for evidence and a lasting habit of listening closely. She learned that knowledge was not a performance. It was a discipline, built from patience, attention, and the willingness to admit what had not yet been understood. From that beginning, her path toward journalism did not arrive as a sudden decision. It formed slowly, through reading, study, and the instinct to pay attention to people and places that other voices often passed over. At Columbia Journalism School, she encountered a demanding standard of craft that matched her own seriousness. There, reporting was not treated as decoration. It was treated as a responsibility. Questions had to be precise. Scenes had to be observed with care. A story had to earn its place by showing why it mattered, not by demanding attention for its own sake. Her time at the London School of Economics deepened that perspective. She was interested in systems, power, and the way institutions shaped private lives. That academic work gave her a wider frame, but it did not pull her away from people. If anything, it sharpened her ability to see how large forces reached into individual experience. She came to value context without losing intimacy. She could move between policy and personal detail without treating either one as separate from the other. That balance became part of her voice. In Copenhagen, she built a life with Olstob that was steady, practical, and full of plans. They were preparing for a move to Beijing, a city that represented both a professional challenge and a shared future. The move mattered because it reflected who she was at the center of her life. Someone willing to enter unfamiliar places, not for spectacle, but for understanding. She did not build distance from the world. She moved toward it with purpose, bringing the people closest to her into the same horizon. That willingness shaped the way she worked. Kim was drawn to depth rather than speed, to reporting that took time to explain what was hidden beneath the obvious. She was not interested in easy simplifications. She wanted the texture of a person's choices, the pressure behind a public event, the details that made a life legible. She often turned toward people on the edges of a story, not because they were marginal in importance, but because they were often where the truth could be seen most clearly. Her journalism carried a steady moral intelligence. She understood that complexity was not an obstacle to clarity. It was part of the truth itself. A rushed account could flatten a person into a headline. A careful one could restore dimension. That was the standard she seemed to carry everywhere she went. It appeared in the assignments she chose, in the questions she asked, and in the respect she showed to the people she interviewed. She listened for contradiction without treating contradiction as failure. She knew that a person could be both guarded and open, both ordinary and extraordinary, and that responsible reporting had to leave room for that reality. This is why Kim belonged in the story not as a symbol, but as a working journalist with a clear method and an exacting conscience. She was curious, yes, but never careless. She was open, but not naive. She trusted process preparation, and the idea that careful reporting could create understanding where assumptions could not. The world she moved through required those habits. They had brought her this far, into cities, institutions, and conversations that asked her to stay alert without losing empathy. By the time she prepared for the interview that would draw her toward the UC3 Nautilus, those habits were already established. She knew how to enter a subject with seriousness. She knew how to communicate with the people in her life when she was working. She knew how to treat an unusual assignment as part of the job rather than a spectacle. All of that came from the person she had become through years of study, travel, and disciplined practice. What matters here is not only what she had done, but how she did it. Kim Wall was the kind of reporter who believed that the world could be better understood if one looked long enough and carefully enough. She was moving towards stories that required patience, and she was doing so with a life already in motion, a partner beside her, and a future being planned in another city. That combination of rigor, openness, and forward motion defined her far more than any later tragedy ever could. She also had a practical confidence that came through in her working habits. Friends and colleagues described someone who prepared thoroughly, asked precise questions, and treated deadlines as commitments rather than obstacles. That discipline did not make her rigid. It made her dependable. She could step into unfamiliar rooms, listen without forcing a conclusion, and keep the details straight while the larger shape of a story was still forming. In a field that rewards speed, she chose care. In spaces that favored noise, she chose accuracy. Those choices were not dramatic, but they were central to the work she valued. Kim's life in Copenhagen reflected the same balance. Home was not separate from her profession. It was the place where she returned, regrouped, and planned the next assignment with the same steadiness she brought to reporting. The move to Beijing was part of that rhythm, another step in a life built around movement without haste. She was not chasing proximity to danger, and she was not seeking grandeur. She was following the work, trusting that serious reporting required presence, humility, and the willingness to let a story reveal itself at its own pace. That quiet consistency mattered because it gave her presence weight without spectacle. She did not need to dominate a room to understand it. She could watch, wait, and hear what others missed, which is often how the most careful reporting begins. Long before the events tied to the submarine, her life had already taught her how to move through uncertainty with poise, how to respect complexity, and how to keep faith with the people whose stories she carried. That practice defined her work, her relationships, and the seriousness with which she met each assignment daily. Peter Madsen entered public view through engineering, not through institutions. He was self-taught, driven by curiosity, persistence, and a willingness to build without waiting for permission. That background gave his work a certain allure. He seemed to embody a form of modern invention that favored stubborn effort over formal pedigree. For people drawn to makers and risk-takers, that quality was easy to admire. He could speak with the confidence of someone who had spent years turning ideas into objects that moved, floated, launched, and endured. His co-founding of Copenhagen Suborbitals gave that image a wider stage. The project drew attention because it sat at the edge of ambition and improbability. It was a civilian effort to reach towards space through engineering discipline and volunteer labor, a concept that naturally held fascination. Supporters saw daring. Admirers saw vision made practical. Around Madsen, a small but intense culture of respect formed, one that treated technical audacity as proof of character. The machine became part of the myth, and the myth helped carry the man. That myth was strong because Madsen understood how to present vision. He was energetic, articulate, and often disarming in conversation. He could sound committed to progress, experimental in outlook, even generous in the scope of his ideas. To observers meeting him in a public setting, he could appear like a restless builder whose mind moved faster than ordinary caution. That sort of personality often reads as harmless eccentricity when the work itself seems impressive. People wanted to believe that unusual ambition must belong to unusual talent. Yet those closer to him saw contradictions that did not fit neatly into the public image. He could be charming in one moment and sharply impulsive in the next. He could describe a future of possibility while controlling the terms of the present with a firmness that left little room for others. He could seem visionary because he saw what others had not, yet unsettling because that vision did not always coexist with restraint. In private settings, admiration could give way to unease. The same force that made him appear inventive could also make him difficult to trust. There were other details, quieter but telling, that accumulated around him. He liked to occupy the center of the room. He answered questions with confidence that could sound persuasive even when the content shifted under scrutiny. He could make uncertainty seem temporary, as if any concern raised by another person was simply a matter of waiting for his next explanation. That habit mattered because it pushed discomfort out of sight. People learned to keep pace with his certainty, even when something in the interaction felt off balance. That tension matters because it shows how warning signs can remain visible without being treated as urgent. Society often rewards men who appear singular, especially when their work seems to break rules in productive ways. The label of eccentric genius can soften behavior that would otherwise invite closer scrutiny. It turns instability into color, control into intensity, and disregard into a side effect of brilliance. Madsen benefited from that pattern for years. His reputation grew in a field that prized technical daring, and the admiration around him made people less willing to ask what his behavior cost the people near him. The problem is not that innovation deserves suspicion. It is that brilliance is often allowed to excuse conduct that should have been examined on its own terms. When someone is framed as exceptional, ordinary standards can begin to feel optional. That is how a shield forms. The public sees achievement. The private sphere absorbs the pressure. Those who notice discomfort may hesitate to say so, because they assume the problem must lie in their own reading of the situation. In that hesitation, the balance of power grows more stable for the wrong person. By the time the UC3 Nautilus became part of a larger public story, Madsen was already carrying that split identity. To some, he was the inventor, the builder, the man who made impossible machinery appear real. To others, he was difficult, forceful, and harder to read than the polished image suggested. Both versions existed at once, which is part of what made him so troubling. A person can be admired for achievement and still create fear in the spaces he controls. The danger lies in assuming those two facts cannot coexist. That is why this case is not only about a submarine. It is about the power to define a space, to govern who enters it, to decide how it functions, and to shape the story told about it afterward. A machine can become the visible object of attention while the person behind it remains protected by reputation. In this story, the vessel matters, but the greater issue is the authority that came with building it. What looked like an invention from the outside could also become a closed system of control inside. Madsen's public success helped delay that recognition. His image as a daring engineer encouraged others to interpret his intensity as dedication. His projects rewarded optimism, so people kept extending it to him. But admiration does not cancel the pattern. A celebrated figure can still be dangerous in ordinary ways long before a crisis makes that clear. The case forces that truth into view without sentiment. It asks what happens when society mistakes charisma for stability, or technical skill for character, or ambition for proof that someone should be trusted. That is the frame Kim Wall entered when she prepared to interview him. She was approaching a subject who had learned how to be seen as impressive. He had built a machine, a name, and a reputation that could absorb doubt. Yet the story beneath that surface was never just about engineering. It was about a man whose control extended beyond the workshop and into the social belief that gifted people deserve the benefit of every uncertainty. In that sense, the submarine was only the setting. The deeper story was about unchecked power hiding in plain sight. He knew how to benefit from that trust. In public, he could turn technical language into confidence, and confidence into authority. That skill mattered because it let others lower their guard while he kept his own position fixed. He did not need to dominate through force alone. He could do it through reputation, through the assumption that a maker of bold machines must also be a man of sound judgment. That assumption held until the story exposed how fragile it was. In that gap, admiration remained louder than caution for far too long. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Bedtime Black Files, where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Consider hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs it. Your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive. Kim Wall reached this assignment the way she reached most serious stories, by following curiosity with discipline. She was drawn to people whose work sat outside ordinary categories, builders and thinkers whose ideas lived at the edge of public attention. Those subjects could be difficult to define, which was part of the appeal. They asked for patience. They rewarded careful listening. For a reporter like Kim, that made them worth the effort. The UC3 Nautilus fit that pattern. It was unusual enough to invite questions, and the man behind it had built a reputation large enough to support a profile. Madsen was not simply an engineer in the abstract. He was a public figure in a niche world of experimental ambition, someone whose projects had generated admiration, debate, and a steady current of fascination. That combination made him seem, at least on paper, like the kind of person Kim would want to understand in depth. She was interested in how people build unusual lives around technical passion, and how those lives look when examined without simplification. A profile like that was not about praise. It was about observation, context, and the effort required to separate image from substance. The arrangement for the interview followed the practical logic of feature reporting. A subject offers access. A journalist agrees to meet, and both sides treat the exchange as part of the work. In this case, the setting was extraordinary, but the professional reasoning remained familiar. An interview aboard the UC3 Nautilus promised a setting that would reveal something about its builder and the world he occupied. For a reporter, that kind of location could sharpen the story rather than distort it. The vessel itself was part of the subject. It carried his ambitions, his method, and the image he wanted to present. That is why the offer would not have read as alarming from the outside. Kim was not being invited into a random place without context. She was entering a controlled interview environment proposed by the person she intended to write about. In journalism, unusual access often comes with unusual settings. A factory floor, a lab, a workshop, a private office, a remote site, each can become the stage for a story if the reporting purpose is clear. The key question is not whether the place is unusual. It is whether the journalist can understand why the subject wants the meeting there. Kim understood that logic. She knew that the environment can shape testimony, mood, and the way a person presents themselves. She also knew that accepting an interview location does not mean surrendering judgment. It means weighing the value of access against the demands of the story. In this case, the submarine was not a curiosity attached to the assignment. It was part of the assignment itself. To interview Madsen without the vessel would have removed a central piece of the frame. The story she was pursuing was about an inventor, his work, and the world he had made around him. She also moved through the practical side of the arrangement with the calm habits that marked her reporting life. There was no performance in how she handled it. She did not need to dramatize her schedule to make it important. She let people in her life know where she was going, what she was working on, and when she expected to be in touch. That normality matters because it shows how ordinary professional trust can look from the inside. Most people do not step into work thinking they are entering danger. They step in thinking they are doing their job well. Old Staub would have received that information in the same everyday register that defined their life together. A note about the assignment. A mention of the location. The kind of communication that signals routine rather than alarm. There was no reason, from the perspective available to Kim at that moment, to treat the meeting as anything other than another demanding but legitimate interview. She had built a career on entering unfamiliar spaces with care. She trusted preparation, experience, and the basic professionalism that makes reporting possible. That is what makes the moment so difficult in retrospect. From the outside, after the facts are known, the setting can look saturated with warning. But the point of a real journalistic assignment is that the reporter is not working from hindsight. She is working from the information she has, the access she has earned, and the story she believes she can responsibly tell. Kim was not chasing risk. She was following a lead that fit her beat and her standards. The danger was invisible to her because the invitation still looked like work. Consider how often people make similar judgments in ordinary life. You agree to meet someone in a place you have never been because the purpose seems clear. You enter a building, a home, an office, or a vehicle because the context appears professional. You send a message to a partner or friend with the assumption that the day will unfold in the usual way. That does not make the choice careless. It makes it human. We rely on the signals around us, on routine, and on the expectation that a direct purpose means a safe arrangement. Kim's decision followed that same human logic, only within the demands of serious reporting. She had reason to think the interview would produce useful material. She had reason to believe the vessel would help shape the profile. She had reason to trust that a subject who was granting access intended to cooperate with the story in a professional manner. Those reasons were not naive. They were the basis of field reporting. If every unfamiliar space were treated as a threat, much of journalism would become impossible. So the assignment began with the kind of professional confidence that would have seemed entirely normal to her. She had a subject, a vessel, a framework for the piece, and a clear purpose. She was moving toward an interview that matched the work she had spent years doing, careful, patient, and interested in the people and structures that sit just beyond the center of public attention. At that point in the story, the meeting aboard the UC3 Nautilus was not yet a tragedy. It was an assignment worth pursuing, and Kim approached it the way she approached difficult stories everywhere, with preparation, restraint, and trust in the process. That is why the assignment carried no theatrical edge in her mind. It was simply the next careful step in a career built on patience, structure, and earned access alone. August 10th, 2017, began in the ordinary register of a working day. Kim Wall moved through the morning with the steady focus that had carried her through countless assignments before it. There was no reason to mark the date as unusual at the moment. It was a day shaped by preparation, by schedules, by the practical steps that make reporting possible. The harbor at Refshaleoin waited under the same subdued light that had framed the story from the start. But Kim arrived at it as a journalist arriving for work, not as a figure entering a foretold tragedy. The last text she sent to Old Staub fit that same pattern of normalcy. It was brief, warm, and unremarkable in the best possible way. It carried the tone of someone checking in during the flow of a day, not someone signaling distress. That is part of what makes such a message so difficult to hold now. At that moment, it belonged to routine. Later, it would become a final reference point, the kind of small human detail that acquires enormous weight only because the future moved past it. At the harbor, the scene would have been shaped by the same practical order that governs so many professional meetings: the dock, the water, the vessel, the movements of people preparing for departure. Each element belonged to a sequence that had a clear purpose. Kim's presence there was tied to reporting, to the promise of an interview, and to the ordinary expectation that access meant cooperation. The UC3 Nautilus sat in the water as it had before. a machine built to hold the attention of anyone approaching it, but still only a setting until the hatch closed and the day moved beyond the reach of the shore. Kim would have approached the vessel with the composure of someone who knew how to begin an interview in an unfamiliar setting. The first exchanges matter in field reporting. They establish tone, trust, and the practical rhythm of the conversation. A subject presents himself. A journalist listens, asks, observes, and records. The interview aboard the Nautilus would have started there, in the space before the vessel left the dock, where the work still looked like work and nothing more. The purpose was professional. The terms were understood. The setting was unusual, but the function was familiar. The departure changed the shape of that familiarity. Once the vessel pulled away from the harbor, the shoreline of Copenhagen began to recede behind it. The dock lost its immediacy. The harbor lost its public character. What remained was the submarine, the water, and the limited space inside the hull. From the surface, the movement away from land could still appear controlled and even routine. Yet every yard gained in distance reduced the chance that outside conditions could intervene, or that anyone on shore could influence what happened within the sealed space. That is the quiet significance of departure in this case. It was not a dramatic motion at first. It was a transition from visible access to private enclosure. A journalist who had entered a vessel for an interview was now inside a machine whose design placed her further from normal points of contact. The hatch, once sealed, marked the boundary between an assignment that could still be observed from outside and a space that answered only to those already within it. The water did not announce that change. It simply received the vessel and carried it onward. Kim's professional purpose remained unchanged at that moment. She was there to conduct a profile, to speak with Madsen about his work, to collect the details that would make sense of his unusual reputation. That purpose matters because it keeps the scene grounded in the reality of her role. She was not on a personal errand. She was not there to test a theory of danger. She was doing the kind of reporting that asks a journalist to enter a subject's world and learn how that world is structured from the inside. The initial dynamic between reporter and subject would likely have followed the familiar architecture of an interview. Questions, answers, clarifications, observation, small adjustments in tone, these are the basic tools of the form. The subject controls access to some degree because the setting is his. The journalist retains control over the questions and the account. That balance is what gives a feature interview its shape. It is also what allows a skilled reporter to move with calm attention even in unfamiliar surroundings. Kim would have trusted that structure because she had reason to trust the form itself. What makes the day so harrowing in retrospect is the knowledge that the visible structure of the interview did not reflect the actual balance of power once the vessel was underway. From the dock, nothing in the exchange would have looked extraordinary to an observer who did not already know the outcome. A meeting arranged in advance, a subject presenting a story, a journalist entering with a recorder, a notebook, and professional intent. The normal markers were all there. That is what made the setting effective as access and dangerous as the environment. There is also a human side to the scene that remains important even when viewed through the lens of later events. Kim was not moving through the morning as a symbol. She was moving through it as a person with habits, obligations, and a future that still appeared open. Her day had a shape, her work had a purpose, and the interview had a place within the larger pattern of her life. That ordinariness should not be minimized. It is what anchors the emotional truth of the moment. The tragedy only becomes visible when we know how the day ended. So August 10 should be understood as the day when routine carried Kim into a sealed setting under professional terms. The harbor, the dock, the vessel, the last message, the departure, the closing distance from shore. Each detail belongs in sequence because each one moves the story forward without yet revealing its final meaning. The interview had begun as an assignment worth pursuing. By the time the UC3 Nautilus left the harbor, that assignment had become a closed passage into uncertainty, though no one on board would have named it that way yet. For Kim, that kind of beginning was not unusual. Reporters often rely on the clarity of an agreed purpose. A subject agrees to talk, a place is named, and the work begins from there. The risks are measured against the value of the access, and most days the balance holds. That is why the scene deserves to be read carefully rather than sensationally. It shows how ordinary professional judgment can place a person inside extraordinary circumstances without any sign of alarm at the time. In this case, the gap between appearance and outcome was wide, but in the morning itself, all that Kim could see was an interview waiting to be done. That plainness is part of the story here. It was a working morning, a professional meeting, and a routine carried forward in good faith, with no visible reason to call it anything else at all. Inside the hull, the interview no longer belonged to open space or public timing. It belonged to the vessel itself. Once the UC3 Nautilus moved farther from shore, the physical world that had supported Kim's work narrowed to steel, water, and the presence of the person across from her. That narrowing matters. It changes how a conversation breathes. It changes who can leave, who can pause, who can seek help, and who can decide when the exchange ends. On land, a journalist can step back into distance, into street noise, into the social world that surrounds any meeting. Inside a sealed vessel, those options shrink until they are measured in inches, choices, and permission. That is the clinical reality of the setting. The control of the room no longer sat with the person who had arrived to ask questions. It sat with the person who determined movement, access, and the conditions of travel. The vessel was not a neutral backdrop. It was an enclosed instrument with boundaries that did not negotiate. Its passage away from shore did not only change the view from the deck, it altered the balance inside the hull. Every closed hatch, every corridor, every limited route forward or back contributed to a structure in which one person could control the environment while the other could only move within it. Kim entered that environment as a professional carrying out a reporting task. She would have expected the usual dynamics of an interview. One person speaking, one person listening, perhaps a shift in tone, perhaps a pause for clarification. That is normal. What makes the case so disturbing is not that she was interviewing a subject in a confined setting. It is that the setting gradually removed the practical safeguards that make a difficult conversation still feel manageable. The vessel did not need to announce danger in order to create it. The enclosure itself was enough to reshape the terms. The physical safety question is inseparable from that fact. Safety in ordinary life is not abstract. It depends on access to exits, the possibility of intervention, and the knowledge that other people are near enough to matter. When those elements fade, autonomy becomes harder to exercise in real time. A person can remain composed and still be less free. That is the danger of a controlled environment when it is used against the visitor inside it. The space may look ordinary from the outside, but from within it becomes a field of limited options. The timeline also matters, because time in this case moved silently. The difference between contact and silence was not a dramatic break that anyone could watch unfold in real time. It was a narrowing interval. Kim's final communications marked the last point at which the outside world could still assume continuity. After that, the window closed without announcement. To the mainland, there was only absence. No fresh message, no new signal, no confirming reply that would indicate she was still moving through the day on schedule. The story of the evening would later be reconstructed from those absences as much as from any direct record. That invisible timeline is central to understanding the tension aboard the vessel. The audience naturally wants a moment when the shift becomes obvious, but in real events, the shift is often buried inside routine. A conversation continues. A location changes. A hatch closes. A message is not answered. The first warning is not always a sound. Sometimes it is simply the loss of ordinary contact. In this case, the silence did not arrive all at once in the minds of those on land. It arrived as a gradual recognition that the day had not progressed the way it should have. Meanwhile, inside the submarine, the actual balance of power had already changed. A journalist who had entered with a notebook and a professional purpose was now dependent on the choices of the person who owned the setting. That dependency is the key issue. It affects the ability to leave, to resist, to call out, and to assume that the structure of the meeting still protects the integrity of the work. Once the environment itself becomes part of the control, the interview is no longer just an exchange of words. It is an exercise in who governs the conditions under which words are spoken. This is the point where the conflict must be stated plainly. Kim was doing her job. She was there to ask questions, gather information, and shape a profile from observation and conversation. Madsen, by contrast, had already decided that she would not leave. That sentence carries the whole weight of the case. It explains why the environment matters beyond its physical features. It explains why the dock, the water, and the hatch are not background details but structural facts. It explains why the sealed space inside the hull mattered from the first moment the vessel pulled away. To say that plainly is not to dramatize it. It is to respect the reality of the situation. In many investigations, people speak in abstractions about tension, risk, or atmosphere. Here, the issue is simpler and more severe. One person was working. One person was acting with intent that made escape impossible. The closed setting did not create that intent, but it did make the intent easier to enforce. That is why the vessel is so central to the story. It was both workplace and trap, both subject and instrument, both setting and mechanism. The journalist's options inside the hull were therefore not the same as they had been on the dock. The difference is not merely emotional. It is practical. A person on shore can refuse to continue the exchange and depart. A person on a moving, sealed vessel cannot assume that same freedom. Physical safety becomes tied to the decisions of the person controlling the boat. If the relationship between interviewer and subject is still governed by professional norms, that feels manageable. If those norms are discarded, the same enclosure can become a place where every choice is constrained. That is why the scene must be read with care and without embellishment. The power dynamic shifted because the location shifted. The movement away from land reduced outside visibility and increased internal control. The window between last contact and complete silence was the same window in which Kim's professional presence became something the outside world could no longer verify. None of these details require exaggeration. They are severe on their own. In the end, the conflict is not complicated. A journalist entered a vessel to conduct an interview. A subject used the vessel's isolation to assert control over the meeting and over her ability to leave it. The sea removed witnesses. The hull limited escape. The clock kept moving. By the time the mainland understood that contact had stopped, the balance aboard the UC3 Nautilus had already been broken in a way that could not be repaired by messages, waiting, or hope. That is the tragedy contained in the design of the moment. What began as an assignment moved into a sealed world where professional purpose no longer guaranteed protection. The vessel kept moving, the shore kept receding. As evening moved toward night, the world on shore began to lose its patience with the day. The harbor darkened. The usual movement of people thinned. For old Staub, the change was not dramatic at first. It was the slower kind of concern that arrives when a person who normally keeps contact has not yet done so. He knew Kim's habits. He knew the cadence of her work, the way she checked in when she could, the ordinary pattern that made her life intelligible from the outside. That is why the first missed expectation matters so much. It is not panic. It is recognition. A person who knows someone well can feel the difference between delay and silence. The delay has reasons attached to it. The silence does not. Ole would have moved through that evening, measuring time against Kim's usual rhythm, waiting for the point at which waiting was no longer a reasonable explanation. When that point came, concern became alarm with the quiet force that defines real life. There was no cinematic break, no single instant when certainty arrived. There was only the growing knowledge that something had gone wrong because the day had moved past the shape it was supposed to have. His decision to report her missing was fast, because the circumstances demanded speed, not because he overreacted. That choice later mattered for the investigation. It established an early official clock. It preserved the narrow window in which the day could still be reconstructed from live traces rather than memories alone. In missing person cases, time is not a neutral background. It is evidence. The earlier the report, the sooner police can begin checking movement, communications, and locations, while those records still exist in a usable form. Ole's action ensured that the search began before the trail had fully cooled. What followed was not reassurance, but a spreading absence. There were no new messages from Kim. There was no return call that would settle the matter. There was no reliable sighting that placed her back in the ordinary circulation of the city. In a place like Copenhagen, where movement is dense and public life leaves traces, that lack of confirmation is itself a fact. It means the person is not appearing where she should appear. It means the pattern has broken. Every hour that passed without contact made the absence harder to explain through delay alone. The silence also mattered because it was complete. Not only did Kim not answer, there was no convincing secondary trace that she had returned to shore in the usual way. No simple account from a passerby, no casual confirmation from the harbor, no ordinary sign that the interview had ended and she had resumed her evening. The city did not offer the small pieces of reassurance that sometimes resolve a worry before it becomes a case. Instead, the lack of signals created a field of unanswered questions that widened as night deepened. When the matter entered the hands of authorities, the case was still a missing person inquiry. That label matters because it defines the first operational posture. Officers begin by trying to locate, to verify, to separate absence from harm if possible. They check phones, movements, routes, and known contacts. They build a timeline. They look for the ordinary explanations first because ordinary explanations often exist. But here, the ordinary explanations began to collapse quickly under the weight of the facts. The time of departure, the last contact, the lack of return, and the closed pattern of the evening all pointed in the same direction. Operationally, the transition toward something darker was not a theatrical announcement. It was a shift in judgment driven by accumulated gaps. Investigators no longer had a simple question of where Kim might be. They were confronting the possibility that her absence was not accidental, not delayed, and not something that could be resolved by the next message or the next location check. The case thickened. Search became scrutiny. Hope became a method. Every available record had to be examined against the growing suspicion that the trail did not end in confusion but in intent. That is what the official shift looked like on the ground. Call logs, location checks, harbor activity, witness accounts, vessel movements. The record was assembled piece by piece, each item compared against the others. The aim was to establish whether Kim could still be found alive and where the line of responsibility began. Once the initial assumptions could no longer hold, the question changed from missing person to something that required a criminal framework. The machinery of the investigation adapted accordingly. For Ole, the night must have carried the painful uncertainty that belongs to anyone waiting on a pattern that has failed. He was not yet holding the whole shape of the truth. He was holding fragments, a missing check-in, a delay that had lasted too long, a silence that had become impossible to ignore. That is the brutal position of the person closest to the absent one. He knows enough to fear, but not enough to know. He can only act on what he has, and hope the act comes soon enough to matter. It did matter. The speed of the report preserved urgency. The silence made urgency unavoidable. And the move from missing person work into a more serious investigation marked the moment when the city and the authorities began to understand that Kim had not simply gone quiet on a summer evening. Something had happened to interrupt the ordinary path back home. And once that possibility entered the record, the case could no longer be treated as a routine search. That response also helped shape the emotional record around the case. It gave Kim's absence a timestamp that could be compared against movements, transmissions, and later discoveries. In a case like this, clarity at the beginning can become one of the few protections left to the truth. Without it, the story would have been harder to reconstruct. The search for the UC3 Nautilus began with the kind of patience that belongs to water and weather. In the waters around Copenhagen, teams worked outward from the last known movement, using sonar and surface units to read what the harbor could not tell them directly. The submarine did not vanish into the sea in a clean line. It became a problem of location, depth, and shape. Each sweep of equipment narrowed the field until the vessel was found where it had come to rest, not as a functioning machine, but as a damaged object held by the water. That first location mattered because it changed the case from absence to evidence. The submarine had not simply been lost. It had gone down in a way that required explanation. Bystanders had witnessed the sinking itself, and what they saw did not look like a routine failure. The vessel went under abruptly, in a manner too fast and too final to fit the image of a minor technical mishap. It was the kind of sight people remember because the motion of a boat sinking is not supposed to happen that way in open water, especially not with only one person recovered alive from it. Madsen emerged from the event alone. That fact immediately sharpened the public and investigative attention around the case. If the vessel had carried more than one person, where was the other? If the planned interview had ended normally, why had one person been brought back and not the other? The rescue of Madsen, standing by itself, did not answer those questions. It deepened them. The absence of Kim was no longer a vague concern. It became a direct contradiction that had to be explained by the physical state of the submarine and by the statements made after the sinking. When the wreck was examined, the technical assessment did not support a passive failure. The systems looked compromised in ways that pointed away from accidents and toward action. Valves had been opened. Water had been allowed to enter. Components that should have kept the vessel stable had been altered or bypassed. That kind of damage is not what investigators expect when a machine fails naturally at sea. Natural failure has a pattern. It tends to reveal wear, fracture, loss of function, or cascading mechanical breakdown. This case suggested interference. The submarine had not merely broken, it had been made to fail. That distinction became central very quickly. If the vessel was deliberately sunk, then the sinking itself could not be treated as an unfortunate after effect of the interview. It became part of the event. The act of taking water in, of dropping the submarine into a helpless state, had to be read together with the absence of Kim and with the presence of Madsen alone on the surface. What had appeared at first glance to be a maritime rescue now looked like a scene staged by action rather than chance. Investigators were forced into an immediate question that cut through the entire account. If Kim had safely disembarked, why destroy the only environment that could confirm that claim? The submarine was not just a boat. It was the only enclosed space where her last hours could be examined against physical evidence, the only setting that could either support or refute the version being offered. Sinking that space would not help the truth. It would bury it. That is why the deliberate flooding mattered so much. It removed a witness without a voice. It erased the stage on which the final exchange had occurred. The waters surrounding Copenhagen were therefore more than a search area. They became a forensic landscape. Sonar mapped the depth. Surface crews secured the area, and the damaged hull stood as a mute rebuttal to claims of simple mishap. Each observation pulled the case farther from uncertainty. The recovery teams were no longer looking only for a missing journalist. They were tracking a sequence of events that suggested someone had tried to turn the sea itself into concealment. The power of that realization is in its simplicity. The submarine should have been the place where the interview could be explained. Instead, it became the place where explanation was denied. A legitimate meeting does not end by destroying the setting in which it occurred unless something inside that setting needs to be hidden. That logic quickly became impossible to ignore. The wreck was not merely unfortunate. It was informative. It told the investigators where to begin and what to distrust. In the days that followed, the case started to harden around that contradiction. The vessel had sunk. Madsen had survived. Kim was missing. The technical evidence suggested deliberate action. The surrounding circumstances suggested a person trying to control the story after the fact. Even before the later statements were compared and tested, the submarine itself had already narrowed the field of possible explanations. The sea had not solved the case. It had exposed its first scene. That is why the initial recovery work was so important. It did not yet answer everything, but it established the terms. A submarine had been sunk in a way that did not fit ordinary failure. One person had been rescued alone. Another had disappeared. And the only environment that might have clarified what truly happened had been altered into silence by force. That is where the investigation began to understand that the story of the Nautilus was not about an accident at sea. It was about the effort to make a crime look like one. The first question after the recovery was not philosophical. It was practical. What had been changed inside the boat to let it go down? Once that answer pointed toward deliberate flooding, the rest of the case could not stay in the realm of uncertainty. The submarine had become a sealed record of intent, and that record, though damaged, still refused to match the account that would later be offered for public consumption. The wreck also forced a different kind of listening from the investigators. Every detail on the hull, every intrusion of water, every mismatch between the boat's condition and the explanation being offered had to be read together rather than separately. That was the moment the submarine stopped being a vessel and started becoming testimony. It could not speak, but it could still contradict. For that reason, the recovery became more than a search for a missing body. It was the first practical answer to a designed silence, and it forced the case to move from uncertainty into a confrontation with intent at sea. Once the wreck had been read as evidence rather than an accident, the next task was to read the man beside it. Madsen did not remain with one explanation long enough for it to settle into the record. He moved through stories the way someone moves through locked doors when one key no longer works. Each account appeared after the last one had lost its usefulness, and each new claim had to survive the facts already in circulation. It did not. That is what made the sequence so revealing. The first account was the simplest and the least supported. In that telling, Kim had left the submarine safely that evening. She had disembarked. The interview, whatever its tone or content, had ended. The submersion of the vessel was then treated as a separate event, a technical disaster that had nothing to do with her disappearance. It was a clean narrative because it asked the fewest questions. If she had gotten off the boat, then the problem was no longer inside the boat. The trouble was that no witness, no trace, and no record could support that claim. The harbor did not offer confirmation. The timing did not offer confirmation. The communications did not offer confirmation. The physical scene offered the opposite. That first story was not merely unproven. It was detached from every verifiable element investigators could reach. There was no independent account of Kim leaving the vessel. There was no camera evidence placing her ashore. There was no ordinary chain of movement afterward that would have matched a safe return to the city. The story depended entirely on the authority of the person telling it. In a case already defined by an altered submarine and a missing journalist, that was not enough. Once the first account began to collapse, a second appeared. This one was more dramatic and more defensive. Madsen said a heavy hatch had struck Kim by accident. The claim introduced force, panic, and confusion. It tried to shift the case from concealment to mishap. An accident explained the injury. Panic explained the sinking. The shipboard environment explained the impossibility of exact memory. It was a story built to fit disturbance, but it also introduced a new problem. It had to survive the medical evidence. The post-mortem findings did not match the shape of an accidental blow. The injuries were methodical in their implications, even when the physical act behind them was brutal. Investigators found trauma that did not read as a single misjudged impact. The pattern was not the pattern of a hatch swinging once in the wrong direction. It did not align with a fleeting accident in a cramped space. It pointed toward a sequence of harm that was difficult to reconcile with panic alone. The body did not support the convenient simplicity of the story. That is the key point. Panic can explain confusion. It cannot rewrite injury into something it is not. The evidence demanded a more precise relationship between force and result than the second account could provide. If the injury had been caused by a hatch, the physical marks should have reflected the geometry and limits of such an event. They did not. Instead, the medical findings widened the distance between what was claimed and what had actually happened. The second account did not merely sound implausible, it was overtaken by the body itself. After that, a third account emerged, and with it came the clearest sign yet that the problem was not confusion, but adjustment. In this new explanation, Madsen said Kim had died from carbon monoxide poisoning while he was on deck. It was a different kind of defense altogether. This version tried to remove direct action by introducing an invisible hazard. It suggested an atmospheric failure, a tragic unseen accumulation, a death beyond anyone's immediate control. On paper, that kind of claim can seem difficult to disprove. In this case, it was not. The problem was physical impossibility. The conditions described did not match the forensic data. There was no supporting evidence for carbon monoxide as the cause of death. There was no medical basis strong enough to displace the earlier findings. There was no environmental record that made the account plausible. The story attempted to move death outside the reach of intention, but the science did not follow it there. The vessel, the injuries, and the sequence of events all resisted the claim. What was offered as an explanation became instead another sign of retreat. What matters most is the order in which these stories appeared. Each one came only after the last had become impossible to maintain. The safe disembarkation story survived until the wreck and timeline made it unstable. The hatch story arrived after the first version no longer held. The carbon monoxide story followed once the second version had also failed to match the forensic record. This was not random confusion. It was an adaptation under pressure. The story kept changing because the evidence kept closing the exits. Investigators could see the pattern clearly. The changes were not driven by a search for truth. They were driven by the need to keep some accounts alive in the face of facts that refused to cooperate. Each revision marked the point where the previous one had become indefensible. That is not how memory behaves when someone is merely uncertain. It is how narrative behaves when someone is trying to stay ahead of the record. The effect on the case was profound. Instead of one unstable statement, there were three incompatible ones, each undermining the others. None could stand alone. Together they formed a portrait of a speaker who was not recalling events, but editing them. The substance of the changes mattered less than the logic behind them. First remove Kim from the scene, then introduce an accident, then move the cause of death into the air itself. With every shift, the account moved farther from responsibility and farther from what the evidence could tolerate. For investigators, this was no longer a matter of choosing which explanation sounded best. It was a matter of watching explanations collapse in sequence. The submarine had already shown deliberate interference. The body had already resisted the story of an accident. The final claim, stripped of support, became evidence of the same thing the wreck had suggested. The narrative was being built after the fact, not discovered through recollection. That pattern made Madsen's testimony itself part of the case. Every new version revealed how he responded when the old one failed. He did not return to the same answer. He replaced it. That replacement, repeated 3 times, became one of the strongest clues in the file. It showed a mind working to preserve control over the story, even as the material evidence pushed in the opposite direction. By the end of those 3 accounts, the central issue was no longer whether the details lined up. They did not. The issue was why the details kept changing. And that question led the investigation away from the accident, away from uncertainty, and toward a much darker conclusion about what had happened in the sealed space of the submarine. The facts did not bend, and his account kept breaking again. Once the stories had failed, the evidence remained. That was the force investigators could not escape. Words could be revised, explanations could shift, but the physical record left behind on land and in devices did not need to persuade anyone. It simply stood there, resistant to revision, and it widened the gap between the account being offered and the reality it described. On August 21, 2017, that record became impossible to ignore. Kim's remains were found on Amager Island, and the discovery did not arrive as a single clean image. It came through a difficult recovery that revealed how deliberately her body had been handled after death. The remains were weighted. They had been placed with intention. They were recovered in pieces across multiple locations, a fact that immediately told investigators the same thing from several directions. This was not the result of an accident at sea, and it was not the product of drift or chance. The significance of the location mattered as much as the discovery itself. Amager Island was not where a body would naturally gather after a routine loss at water. The dispersal of the remains across separate sites meant someone had chosen how to divide and place them. That choice mattered. It meant the post-mortem actions were not random reactions to panic. They were controlled acts carried out after the killing. Acts designed to interfere with recovery and delay recognition. Even before the full forensic analysis was completed, the pattern of placement was already speaking. Forensic examination deepened that conclusion. The injuries on Kim's remains showed multiple points of trauma. They did not point to a single accidental event. They did not fit a lone impact, a one-time collapse, or any story in which panic and confusion could be stretched into explanation. The body carried evidence of harm that had to be read across more than one moment. That is why the medical findings were so devastating to the defensive stories that had been offered. A hatch strike does not explain a set of injuries that do not belong to one clean collision. Carbon monoxide does not explain trauma. A safe disembarkation explains nothing at all. The violence reflected in the remains also resisted any attempt to reduce the death to a brief mistake in a cramped space. The body told investigators that force had been repeated or applied in more than one way. The findings were not compatible with the language of panic because panic does not produce coherent forensic structure. It produces noise, haste, and disorder. What the analysis revealed instead was a sequence with enough control to leave behind a body that could still be examined and understood. That distinction mattered, because it stripped the event of the last shelter accidental narrative might have offered. At the same time, investigators turned to digital material recovered from Madsen's devices. What they found did not function as proof by itself, but it sharpened the account. The content included violent material, and the relevance was not treated as coincidence. It was used as a corroborating motive, part of a broader pattern that aligned with the physical evidence rather than standing apart from it. The digital record did not create the case, but it supported the reading that this was not a spontaneous tragedy that later acquired structure. It was a sequence in which intent could be traced before, during, and after the event. That is why the investigators did not treat the devices as an isolated curiosity. They treated them as part of the same chain that included the wreck, the changing stories, and the condition of the remains. A person who controls a story after the fact often leaves a trail before the fact as well. The digital material gave the case another layer of consistency. It was not a single dramatic revelation. It was a pattern that fit the rest of the file too well to dismiss. The post-mortem actions were perhaps the clearest sign of all. Dispersal, weighting, and location choice are not neutral acts. They are not what chaos looks like. They are what control looks like after death. Someone had decided how to make recovery harder. Someone had chosen to divide the body and place the parts in ways that would delay discovery and complicate interpretation. That is a deliberate logic, one that assumes time, opportunity, and a willingness to shape what investigators would later see. when those choices were placed beside the injuries and the digital evidence, the direction of the case became harder to deny. The remains were not hidden by nature, they were hidden by action. The devices were not carrying random information, they were carrying material that echoed the case's violence. The body was not showing the residue of one accident. It was showing the consequence of force that had crossed the boundary from immediate harm into calculated disposal. Each piece of evidence refused to hide what the others were saying. The remains on Amager Island confirmed that the body had been managed after death. The trauma confirmed that the death itself was violent and inconsistent with a single mishap. The digital content confirmed that violent material was not accidental background noise, but part of the larger investigative record. Together, they created a view of the case that the changing stories could not disrupt. That was the moment the investigation gained its strongest shape. Not because everything was fully understood, but because the evidence no longer pointed in different directions. It converged. What had first appeared as a missing person case, then a sinking, then an unstable set of explanations, now showed the marks of a deliberate sequence. The sea had carried the event away from view for a time, but it had not erased the structure of what happened. And that structure was visible in the harshest way possible, through the body, through the devices, and through the choices made after death. None of those elements could be made to fit the story of an accident. None of them could be softened into confusion. They belonged to a pattern of control that investigators could not ignore, a pattern that held the case together even when the speaker's own account continued to break apart. The evidence did not need to shout. It only needed to remain in place. In this case, that was enough to expose the truth the stories had tried to cover. The discovery also changed the tone of the investigation. It was no longer necessary to wonder whether the case might still yield a benign explanation if enough uncertainty remained. The remains had answered that possibility. Their condition, their placement, and their recovery across separate locations all pointed in the same direction. The case was moving away from ambiguity and toward a conclusion that could be supported point by point. That was important because it allowed investigators to read the story in sequence: the false account, the damaged vessel, the body, the devices, and finally the deliberate effort to manage what would be found. Nothing in that sequence was random. Nothing in it depended on guesswork. It was a chain of choices, and every link reinforced the next. That chain left no space for accident. By the time the physical evidence, the digital material, the behavioral pattern, and the shifting statements were placed side by side, the case no longer depended on any single fact to carry the whole weight. Each part reinforced the others. The remains explained why the death could not be treated as an accident. The devices added context that aligned with violence. The changing accounts showed not uncertainty, but adaptation. The sequence of events inside the submarine showed that the setting itself had been used as part of the act. Together, those elements formed a conclusion that could be argued without forcing any one piece beyond what it could prove on its own. That convergence mattered because it removed the last shelter for the idea that this was an ordinary disappearance that later became complicated. A disappearance can leave room for hope, delay, and ambiguity. This case did not. The vessel had been altered. The body had been managed. The stories had been revised. The recovered evidence kept pointing in one direction, and that direction was no longer speculative. It was prosecutable. The shape of the case had hardened into something that could be presented not as a mystery waiting for a final clue, but as a sequence of acts with a defined result. At the center of that sequence stood the submarine itself. The controlled environment was not an incidental backdrop. It was the mechanism that made the crime possible. The space had no witnesses, no outside interruption, and one authority figure with the power to direct movement, access, and explanation. That imbalance was not a detail on the margins. It was the condition that allowed the event to unfold without immediate contradiction. In a sealed vessel, with the water close, the exits limited, and the interview framed as ordinary, Control over the environment became control over the entire encounter. That is why investigators treated the submarine not simply as a location, but as an active part of the case. The vessel gave one person command over the setting while denying the other the protection that an open and public space might have provided. The absence of witnesses mattered because it left the record vulnerable to whatever version would be told afterward. The physical structure mattered because it allowed the scene to be altered, then sunk, then explained differently. The environment was not background. It was an instrument. From there, the psychological shape of Madsen became clearer to investigators. He appeared as someone who wanted to control conditions first and interpretations second. He managed the image. He adjusted the narrative. He responded to pressure not by settling into one account, but by replacing one account with another when the facts threatened to expose the first. That pattern was visible across the entire file. In the wreck, in the statements, in the handling of the remains, and in the device content that fit the broader mood of violence rather than randomness. This was not a man whose story broke because memory failed him. It was a man whose story changed because control had to be preserved. The distinction is crucial. A confused witness tries to recover a stable account. A strategic witness adapts to preserve the most useful version available. Investigators saw the second pattern. They saw a person who could move from one explanation to the next when evidence made each one unusable, all while holding on to the idea that a revised account could still survive long enough to matter. That understanding pushed the case into a different register. The question was no longer whether something tragic had happened at sea. It was how a tightly controlled space, a missing journalist, a sunken vessel, and 3 incompatible explanations could all belong to the same event unless the event itself had been designed to limit what could be seen. The answer was in the structure. The structure had been built to isolate, to conceal, and then to redirect attention once the immediate act was over. In that sense, the submarine did more than carry the crime. It gave it form. The enclosed space made it possible for one person to manage the meeting, the movement, and the afterstory. It allowed the crime to be presented first as disappearance, then as mishap, then as an invisible hazard when the earlier claims no longer held. But the more the narrative shifted, the more obvious the underlying design became. Control had been present from the beginning, and it remained visible even after the water had closed over the hull. What follows from that is not yet a verdict in words, but it is a direction the evidence already supports. The prosecution did not need to invent coherence. The case had produced it. The body, the device content, the wreck, and the statements had all pressed toward the same conclusion. The story that once appeared fractured was now arranged by investigators into a line that ended in homicide, not uncertainty. That line did not rely on drama. It relied on consistency. And that is where the final force of the case begins to emerge. Not in the retelling of the event, but in the way every attempt to escape its meaning failed. The vessel could be sunk, the account could be revised, the remains could be divided and weighted, and the digital material could be examined. Still, the structure held. Still, the pattern remained. Still, the same central fact returned. The setting was controlled, the explanation shifted, and the evidence would not cooperate with innocence. Justice is now moving toward the point where every constructed story must answer for itself. The courtroom will not need to invent what happened. It will only need to strip away what was built to conceal it, layer by layer, until nothing remains except the bones of the truth. And when that happens, the facts that once seemed scattered will remain in their proper order, exposing not confusion but intent, and not a fading story, but a deliberate crime at last in full. Inside the Copenhagen courtroom, the story of the submarine was no longer hidden beneath water or scattered across reports. It had been gathered into a legal setting where every claim had to stand on record, and where the absence of an eyewitness did not weaken the case so much as sharpen its dependence on evidence alone. There was no one who could simply say what had happened inside the vessel and settle the matter by memory. The trial had to be built from what could be proven, what could be contradicted, and what the physical world had already preserved. That structure gave the proceedings their severity. The courtroom did not offer comfort, only scrutiny. The prosecution had to assemble the truth from layers that had already been established in fragments: the timeline of the trip, the forensic findings, the digital material recovered from devices, and the three narratives that had each collapsed under pressure. No single element was enough on its own. The strength of the case came from convergence. Each part of the record answered a different form of denial. Together they formed a map of deception that could be followed step by step. The timeline mattered because it fixed the sequence before interpretation could blur it. The interview, the disappearance, the sinking, the recovery, the discovery of remains, and the revisions and explanation all sat in a single line that refused to bend. The forensic testimony mattered because it translated violence into fact. The injuries, the state of the remains, and the post-mortem handling all pointed away from the accident and toward deliberate action. The digital evidence added a further layer, not as a sensational aside, but as corroboration that fit the rest of the record too well to ignore. Nothing in the prosecution's presentation depended on drama. It depended on the stubborn logic of things that did not match the story being told. That logic tightened around Madsen when he took the stand. He appeared composed, controlled, and clinically detached, as if distance itself might protect him from the weight of the evidence. He answered in a manner that suggested calculation rather than surrender. He did not seem to crumble under attention. He seemed to manage it. Yet control has a cost, and the courtroom was one of the few places where that cost could be measured in public. Under cross-examination, brief fractures appeared. A pause stretched too long. An answer arrived too late. A contradiction could not be cleaned away fast enough. Those moments did not transform the entire testimony, but they revealed something important. The composure was not proof of innocence. It was a surface being held in place. The prosecution used that tension carefully. It did not need to dramatize his demeanor. The evidence did enough. Instead, it let the contrast speak for itself. A man who claimed uncertainty had given 3 incompatible accounts. A man who claimed an accident had left behind a vessel altered in ways that pointed toward intent. A man who offered a story of misfortune had devices containing material that fit a broader pattern of violence. Every part of his defense had to contend with something it could not fully explain. The courtroom became the place where those pressures were no longer hidden by water, distance, or delay. When the verdict came, it carried the full weight of the assembled record. He was found guilty of murder, sexual assault, and desecration of a corpse. The sentence was life imprisonment, the most severe penalty Denmark allows. The decision did not emerge from a single dramatic revelation. It emerged from accumulation. The court had listened to the timeline, the forensics, the digital traces, the changing explanations, and the testimony under pressure. What remained after all of it was not ambiguity, but responsibility. That final judgment closed the distance between the submerged setting and the legal truth. The courtroom gave a name to what the evidence had already been saying. This was not an accident that went wrong, and it was not a mystery that dissolved under examination. It was a deliberate sequence of acts that ended in death, and in the effort to conceal death afterward. The law did not need to imagine the story. The evidence had already written its outline, and so the trial became more than a procedural event. It became the place where the constructed narrative failed to survive contact with fact. The submarine had been sunk, the stories had shifted, the remains had been weighted and placed, and the record had been searched for an alternative. None appeared. What the courtroom exposed was not confusion, but a long attempt to create it, and the failure of that attempt under the steady force of evidence. By the end, the truth had been given a name, and that name was not hidden in suggestion or softened by uncertainty. It was spoken plainly, in the language of the law. before the very public that had watched the case move from disappearance to proof. Because there were no eyewitnesses to rescue the story from contradiction, the court had to read silence as carefully as speech. Every gap in the narrative mattered. The absence of an onlooker did not weaken the prosecution's position. It made the material evidence more important, because the physical record could not be intimidated into changing its shape. A hull does not invent an explanation. A body does not edit its own injuries. A device does not fabricate the content stored on it. In that setting, each object became a witness in its own way, and each witness agreed with the others. The three collapsed narratives were especially important for that reason. The first placed Kim safely off the vessel, a claim unsupported by any external record. The second tried to recast the death as a sudden accident, but it failed against the forensic findings. The third shifted responsibility into carbon monoxide, yet no data could carry that explanation. Taken together, those versions did more than contradict one another. They showed how the explanation had changed only after the previous one had become impossible to defend. The court could see the pattern clearly. The story was not being recovered. It was being revised. That was the deeper reason the verdict mattered. It was not simply a punishment. It was the legal acknowledgement that a controlled environment, a controlled narrative, and a controlled aftermath had all been used in service of one outcome. The judgment named what the evidence had already established, that the disappearance had been transformed into homicide by intention, then obscured, then carried into the courtroom where it finally lost its last shelter. The law closed the case by refusing to accept what could not survive proof. In that sense, the courtroom did what the sea could not. It did not erase the event, but it refused to let the event remain disguised. It sorted the fragments into order, measured them against each other, and gave the result the only authority it could bear, a verdict grounded in evidence, not improvisation. That authority marked the end of denial and the beginning of accountability, with no room left for the stories that had tried to replace the truth there. The courtroom had given the case its legal name, but the harder question remained: what kind of mind could move through a sealed encounter, a changing account, and a hidden aftermath, while still trying to preserve the image of control? The answer mattered, because the story was not only about what happened on the water. It was also about the behavior that made such an act possible, and then made it harder to read in the hours and days that followed. Madsen's profile, as investigators and observers came to understand it, was built around control first, performance second, and adaptation whenever the first two were threatened. He seemed to need his surroundings to obey him. That need showed itself in the submarine, where he controlled the space, the movement, the access, and the terms of the encounter. It showed itself afterward in the effort to direct the meaning of events through revised explanations. It showed itself in the way he managed his public image, presenting competence, ambition, and technical seriousness as if those qualities alone could stand in for trustworthiness. The pattern was not one of open collapse. It was one of disciplined adjustment. When one version failed, another appeared. When pressure increased, the narrative changed shape. That ability to adapt without visible remorse made him especially difficult to read in real time. People often expect guilt to announce itself with panic, visible disorder, or collapse. But some individuals protect themselves through composure, not because they are innocent, but because composure is itself part of the strategy. In Madsen's case, the outwardly controlled manner was not an incidental trait. It was a functioning method. The same disciplined surface that helped him present himself to the public could also help him delay scrutiny, resist contradiction, and keep attention focused on the version of events that served him best for as long as possible. There was another layer to that protection, and it was cultural. He existed in a public environment that often romanticizes eccentric brilliance. A man who appears inventive, technically gifted, unusual, or self-directed can be granted a kind of narrative immunity. People soften warning signs by translating them into personality. They mistake volatility for genius, detachment for focus, and oddness for harmlessness. That tendency can flatten what others have already noticed. It can turn repeated discomfort into background noise. It can make the atmosphere around a person seem merely idiosyncratic when it is actually unsafe. This mattered in the present case because the warning signs did not appear only after the crime. They had been observed over time. What society sometimes excuses as an unconventional temperament can, in a darker context, be a pattern of control, entitlement, and boundary testing. The cultural habit of admiring the myth of the brilliant maverick allowed those signs to remain undervalued. It created space for the public version of Madsen to continue. Functioning even as the private version, as revealed by the case, depended on manipulation and concealment. The tragedy also exposes something more specific and more painful, the vulnerability at the center of journalistic work itself. Reporting depends on openness. It depends on the willingness to enter unfamiliar settings, to speak with people others may avoid, to ask difficult questions, and to trust professional arrangements long enough for a story to emerge. Those are not flaws. They are the qualities that make journalism possible. But in this case, the very traits that define strong reporting became the point of exposure. Curiosity created access. Professional trust created proximity. Openness made the encounter possible. That is why the case resonates beyond the facts of one crime. It shows how a person can exploit the necessary trust built into fieldwork. A journalist must believe that an interview arrangement is real, that an invitation is what it claims to be, and that the setting will remain within the bounds described. That trust is not naivety. It is part of the profession. The betrayal lies not in the openness itself, but in the decision to turn it into an instrument of harm. The responsibility rests entirely with the one who used trust as a route to violence. Madsen's behavior after the event only reinforced that reading. He did not respond like someone overwhelmed by an irreversible mistake. He responded like someone trying to preserve a usable version of events, while the ground beneath it shifted. That is the psychology of control under pressure. It is not a search for truth. It is a search for a narrative that will survive. Such a mind does not need to feel open remorse to be dangerous. It needs only to keep adjusting until the immediate threat is contained. The absence of emotional collapse should never be mistaken for the absence of moral collapse. Understanding that difference is essential if the case is to be remembered clearly. The point is not to turn the world into a place of suspicion, nor to teach that curiosity should be punished with fear. That would be a betrayal of the values Kim Wall lived by. The lesson is narrower and more exact. The world remains worth approaching with openness, but openness must never be asked to bear the blame for violence committed against it. The fault lies not in trust, but in the person who breaks it. The fault lies not in curiosity, but in the choice to exploit it. That is the moral weight of psychology in this case. Madsen's controlled mind reveals how violence can hide inside composure, how image can be used to delay recognition, and how adaptation can serve concealment instead of accountability. But it also clarifies where responsibility belongs. It does not belong to the journalist who accepted an interview, or to the profession that values access, or to the society that sometimes misreads charisma as character. It belongs wholly to the one who turned opportunity into betrayal. And that distinction matters because it allows the story to end without surrendering its values. The proper response is not to distrust the world more deeply. It is to recognize more clearly that trust must be met with honesty, and when it is not, the shame belongs only to the betrayer. That is why the final judgment does more than punish a crime. It restores the meaning of the values that were exploited. It says that curiosity is not guilt, that professionalism is not weakness, and that a person who uses trust as cover is the one who must carry the full moral weight of the betrayal. The lesson leaves vigilance intact without surrendering the openness that makes work possible. The case did not end when the verdict was read. Its effect widened beyond the courtroom reaching into newsrooms, maritime discussions, and public debate with a force that came from how ordinary the original arrangement had seemed before it turned catastrophic. For journalists, the immediate lesson was not abstract. It was practical, and it concerned the steps that shape field reporting before a story ever begins. Conversations returned to access agreements, contact verification, travel plans, check-in schedules, and the question of what should be in place when an interview requires entering a private or remote environment. What had once been treated as routine precautions began to look, in hindsight, like essential protections that could not be optional. Within journalism communities, the story prompted a renewed examination of how trust is granted and how that trust can be structured without losing the openness that reporting depends on. Reporters and editors discussed what it means to accept an invitation into a controlled space, especially when the subject of the interview owns the setting and can shape the conditions of the encounter. The case showed that risk assessment is not a bureaucratic add-on. It is part of the craft. It includes confirming who knows the location, who can verify the plan, who is expecting the reporter back, and what signal should be sent if the agreed schedule breaks down. Those questions did not emerge from paranoia. They emerged from the recognition that professional curiosity must be paired with professional protection. The same conversations extended to the structure of access itself. Journalistic work often relies on being invited into places and conversations that are not public. That openness is valuable because it allows difficult stories to be told from the inside. But the case made plain that access should never be treated as harmless simply because it is professional. A sealed vessel, a secluded setting, or a meeting controlled by one person changes the balance of safety in ways that cannot be ignored. News organizations began to think more carefully about when an assignment requires an additional layer of oversight, a check-in partner, or a plan that can be activated if communication fails. The story became a reminder that the conditions around reporting are part of reporting itself. Those concerns were not limited to journalism. Maritime safety discussions were also sharpened by what the case revealed. The deliberate sinking of the vessel, combined with the absence of any external monitoring during the trip, raised painful questions about how isolated a voyage can become once it moves beyond ordinary visibility. The submarine was not a passenger ferry or a crowded route. It was a private environment with one dominant operator and little outside oversight. That made the gap between what was expected and what could be independently observed especially dangerous. The case pushed observers to think about emergency procedures, tracking, communication, and the vulnerability created when a trip occurs outside the reach of ordinary witnesses. In that setting, the vessel itself became a symbol of more than one failure. It was a crime scene, but it also illustrated how a closed environment can conceal both intent and consequence until too late. Maritime safety professionals and commentators considered how remote or privately controlled craft might be monitored more effectively without pretending that every risk can be eliminated. The point was not to turn the sea into a place of constant surveillance. The point was to recognize that when a vessel disappears from view, everyone involved is more exposed to the consequences of silence. The absence of external monitoring during the trip was no longer just a factual detail. It became part of a larger safety conversation. The ripple of the case also reached a broader societal question: how violence against women operates in isolated environments, where power is concentrated and witness is absent. The story forced many people to confront the ease with which authority can become abused when the space is controlled by one person and the other has limited ability to leave, call for help, or interrupt the situation. That pattern is not unique to this case, but this case made it visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. It showed how isolation can intensify vulnerability and how the structure of a setting can be used to mask what is happening inside it. This broader conversation mattered because it resisted the temptation to treat the event as exceptional in a way that removes it from ordinary social patterns. The truth was more uncomfortable. The same dynamics that made the event possible exist in many forms. In many places, whenever power is concentrated and accountability is weak. The case became one more point in a larger public reckoning about how control, entitlement, and gendered violence can intersect. It reminded audiences that harm does not always announce itself in obvious forms. Sometimes it hides in familiarity, in professionalism, in technical competence, and in the assumption that a private setting remains safe because it is organized and deliberate. For that reason, the legacy of the case in public discussion was not merely fear. It was attentiveness. People spoke about how to look more closely at the conditions around trust, not to destroy trust, but to protect it from being exploited. Journalists examined their procedures. Maritime observers considered monitoring gaps. Broader audiences reflected on how easily a confined environment can become an instrument of power. These conversations were painful, but they were necessary because they pushed the case into a space where the lesson could be used rather than merely mourned. If this story has continued to matter, it is because the ripples have not stayed contained. They moved into meetings, training sessions, editorial conversations, safety reviews, and private reflections about risk and responsibility. They also moved outward through every retelling that refused to let the event fade into statistics or spectacle. If this account has helped clarify why that matters, share the video as an act of amplification. Share it for the reporters who still step into uncertain places, for the readers who depend on their courage, and for Kim Wall, whose commitment to stories that need to be heard remains larger than the silence that was forced upon her. That amplification matters because remembrance is not passive. It keeps pressure on institutions to improve procedure, on editors to ask harder questions, and on audiences to understand that safety and truth are part of the same responsibility. The story continues when it is shared with that purpose, not as sensation, but as a reminder that vigilance can honor the life it cannot restore going forward. The case closes not with disappearance, but with continuation. What remains after the verdict is not only the record of what was taken from Kim Wall, but the evidence of what her life has continued to create. The memorial fund established in her name stands as one of the clearest expressions of that continuity. It exists to support the kind of journalism she believed in, the kind that requires curiosity, rigor, patience, and the willingness to go where a story is difficult to reach. Its purpose is practical and living, not ceremonial. It helps carry forward the work she built her career around by opening opportunities to reporters who want to pursue work of depth, independence, and seriousness. That matters because legacy is often spoken of as if it were abstract. In this case, it is concrete. The fund reaches into the future by giving material support to the next generation of journalists whose instincts resemble Kim's own. It reinforces the idea that reporting is not merely a profession of observation, but a form of commitment to the public value of knowing. By funding work that reflects her approach, the memorial does not freeze her in memory. It extends her influence into new reporting, new voices, and new investigations that carry the same desire to understand the world on its own terms. That extension is inseparable from the writing she left behind. To return to Kim Wall's work is to encounter a voice defined by precision, empathy, and attention. Her storytelling did not rely on spectacle. It relied on detail that revealed character and context, on structure that allowed a subject to emerge without being flattened, and on a sense that people and places deserve to be seen with care. She wrote in a way that made the reader feel the texture of a place and the complexity of the people within it. The result was journalism that did not merely inform. It widened my understanding. What her writing shows most clearly is that her voice was already larger than the event that ended her life. The force of her work did not come from tragedy. It came from method, discipline, and an intelligence that knew how to listen before it spoke. That is why the case cannot define her. The case marks the violence done to her, but it does not contain the meaning of her work. The evidence of her voice remains in the writing itself, in the calm authority of her reporting, and in the way she treated subjects with enough seriousness to let them reveal themselves. Her voice has not been diminished. It has been made more visible because readers now return to it with a deeper awareness of what was at stake. There is a quiet irony at the center of this story. The man who tried to reduce Kim Wall to silence did the opposite of what he intended. He ensured that her name, her work, and her values would travel farther than they might have in ordinary course. That does not redeem the violence. Nothing can. But it does reveal the failure of the attempt to erase her. The more the case was examined, the more her story expanded beyond the event that tried to swallow it. Her life came into focus through the very effort to obscure it. The result is a form of endurance that belongs not to the crime, but to her. That endurance is also visible in the way people speak about her now. They speak not only of the loss, but of the standard she represented. She embodied a kind of journalism that asks for precision without losing humanity, and that balance remains a model for the work others continue to do. In that sense, remembering Kim Wall is not a passive act of mourning. It is an active refusal to let the finality of violence define the final meaning of a life spent seeking truth. As the story reaches its close, the soundscape changes. Rain settles in, steady and continuous, carrying the listener towards stillness. Beneath it, deep-sea frequencies begin to rise, low and immersive, not as threat but as atmosphere. The effect is contemplative, giving space for reflection rather than reaction. The listener is invited to remain with the weight of what has been told, to sit with the absence that was imposed, and to hear in the rain and pressure of the sea a reminder that some stories are carried forward not by force, but by memory, care, and repeated telling. This final movement leaves the audience where the case itself cannot leave them, with responsibility. To remember Kim Wall is to honor the work she did, the voice she used, and the future she made room for in others. It is to understand that what was attempted against her failed to contain her impact. The story she was building did not end in the water. It continues in every project the fund supports, in every article that follows her standard of care, and in every reader who returns to her work and finds, still intact, the clarity of a voice that refuses to disappear. The Memorial Fund also serves as a practical bridge between grief and action. It turns remembrance into support for fieldwork, travel, research, and the patient reporting that often goes unseen until it changes public understanding. That kind of support honors the way Kim worked, with seriousness towards sources, respect for complexity, and the courage to pursue stories that mattered even when they required distance from comfort. The fund keeps that method alive by making it easier for others to follow a similar path. In that way, her legacy is not only preserved, but renewed. Each journalist helped by the fund carries a small part of that standard into the world, and each finished story becomes another answer to the effort that tried to end her contribution. The result is not simple consolation. It is continuation, which in this case is the stronger form of remembrance. Even now, the work she inspired keeps moving outward, shaped by the same patience and clarity she brought to every assignment. It proves that a life devoted to truth can still guide others long after the final page has turned. As the rain continues and the low frequencies deepen, the closing moments leave room for that truth to settle. The listener is not asked to forget the crime, only to hold alongside it the work Kim created, the people she helped, and the stories that still move because she chose to tell them today onward still. Thank you for spending your night with the Kim Walls case. Have a wonderful, cozy night. See you on the next one.